In any event, all righty. The first permanent settlement of white Europeans in North America was established in 1607 at Jamestown, Virginia. And just 12 years later, in 1619, two transformative events took place. The colonists established a General Assembly, whose members would be elected by male landowners, and the first slave traders arrived, with the first slaves brought from Africa. Thus began the parallel existence of democratic representative government and race-based slavery, which would characterize life in North America, each growing ever stronger for the next 2.5 centuries, an escalating tension which would culminate in the momentous events of my own day. Now, during the 80 years from 1620 to 1700, approximately 21,000 slaves were brought to the 13 colonies. But during the next 80 years, this increased more than 12-fold to 267,000. Even so, the total number of slaves brought to the colonies during this time was only about 2.5% of the total taken from Africa. Far larger numbers were taken to South and Central America and the Caribbean. Now, after the Revolutionary War, the colonies agreed to the Articles of Confederation, which provided for a very weak national government and made no mention of slavery, leaving this up to the individual states to regulate. But soon after, they agreed to adopt a new constitution, which would create a much stronger national government, a more perfect union. By this time, Massachusetts had already abolished slavery, and other northern states were moving in that direction, while in the South, slavery was becoming more and more important to the economy and increasingly entrenched in the society. As a result, it took several significant compromises over slavery for the colonies to come to an agreement on their new government. First, the northern states agreed to allow slavery to continue and to allow slave owners to retrieve fugitive slaves, while the southern states agreed that as of 1808, Congress could pass a law prohibiting new slaves being brought from Africa. Next, representation in the Congress would be equal in the Senate, thus preserving the power of the states, but based on population in the House of Representatives. Determining that population would require another compromise, the infamous 3/5 rule, by which a slave would count as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation. Now, these compromises regarding the Congress meant that the southern states would have political power disproportionate to their voting population, which is why the South would dominate the national government for years to come. Of the first 12 presidents, 9 were from the South. 8 of these gentlemen were slave owners while they were president, while the 9th had previously been a slave owner. In addition, the 3 presidents from the North each served only 1 term, meaning that during the first 61 years of our republic, during only 12 of those years, was the president a Northerner. In a similar manner, 3 of the first 5 chief justices of the Supreme Court were from the South, and the last 2 of them, John Marshall and Roger Taney, would rule the court for a combined 63 years. Oh, both slave owners, by the way. Now, this kind of serves to describe the background and situation as I grew up in the early part of the 19th century. I was born in Kentucky in 1809, spent the first 7 years of my life there. Kentucky was a slave state, and there were some 1,000 slaves living in Hardin County where we lived, about 1/8 of the population. Though I saw slaves, however, I had limited interaction with them. My father and mother were opposed to slavery, believing it to be an injustice and an iniquity, and our family was affiliated with a church which was decidedly anti-slavery. As I grew up, I became aware that debates over slavery sometimes created tensions in communities, in churches, even in families. When I was 7 years old, my father decided to move the family to Indiana, which, having been part of the Northwest Territory, was about to enter the Union as a free state. The reason for the move was partly to get away from slavery, also partly due to land titles being more secure in Indiana. Although Indiana was ostensibly a free state, there were as few slaves there, There were even attempts by pro-slavery factions to make slavery legal there. The same would happen in Illinois, a state I would later reside in. When I was 19 years old and still residing in Indiana, I made a trip which would give me far greater firsthand knowledge of slavery. The biggest landowner in our town and the owner of a general store hired me to accompany his son on a flatboat down the Ohio River and then down the Mississippi, all the way to New Orleans. As we traveled, we sold our cargo or traded it for products such as tobacco, cotton, and sugar, all grown, I knew, with slave labor. In fact, the further south we went, the more slaves we saw. We also saw how their conditions seemed to grow ever harsher, especially on the sugar plantations. We finally arrived in New Orleans, the largest city I'd ever set eyes on, and where I saw something I never wanted to see again. Human beings in chains being displayed for all the world to see, sold to the highest bidder, a slave auction, men, women, and children. Human beings for sale. And there was nothing I could do about it. According to the laws of our nation, this was all right to do. Well, back home in Indiana, I reached the age of 21, meaning I could leave home. But just then, my father decided to move to Illinois, and I agreed to come along and help the family get settled. I stayed on for a year, and then I set out on my own. I had been hired for another flatboat trip to New Orleans that spring. I once again witnessed a slave auction, was greatly distressed by it. Upon returning to Illinois, I settled in the town of New Salem in Sangamon County, of whose 12,000 residents, only about 40 were Black. About 2/3 of these were free. Most worked as servants for white families. This means that there were about a dozen Black slaves living in the county at the time, despite the fact that Illinois was a free state. This was the same for the state as a whole. Of the approximately 2,400 Black persons living in Illinois in 1830, about 1/3 were slaves. There were also laws on the books passed by the General Assembly, the state legislature, known as the Black Codes. These laws were designed to discourage free Blacks from immigrating to the state, also to discourage runaway slaves from going there. Most or all of these laws would still be on the books well into the 1850s. During my 6 years at New Salem, I worked various odd jobs while also studying hard to become an attorney at law, greatly encouraged by John Todd Stewart, a lawyer in Springfield. Mr. Stewart, who was one of the few people who owned slaves in the county, would later take me on as his junior law partner. He would also introduce me to his cousin, Miss Mary Todd. It was also in New Salem that I first ran for public office, the Illinois General Assembly, and was elected on my second try when I was 25 years old. I would serve 4 terms, or 8 years, even after moving to Springfield, eventually becoming a leading member of the Whig Party. I focused most of my political efforts on economic issues, most importantly the need for our young state to improve our waterways and roads, build railroads and canals, etc. The slavery question did not receive much attention. It was deemed a regional issue with little relevance to Illinois. My last term in the General Assembly ended in 1841, and I didn't hold any political office for the next several years. But then I was elected to Congress, where I would serve 1 term from 1847 to 49. The most significant event of this time period was the Mexican War, which my party, the Whigs, considered a simple land grab on the part of President Polk in order to get more territory into which to extend slavery. As a member of Congress, I found myself much further embroiled in the national debate about slavery. Those of us who were opposed to slavery couldn't do anything about it in the southern states where it already existed, for it was protected by the Constitution. But we could fight against its extension into the Western territories, and we could also weigh in on the controversial subject of slavery in the District of Columbia, which, as the seat of the federal government, was subject to congressional oversight. It had long been abhorrent to Northerners that slavery existed in the nation's capital, especially the slave auctions, some of which took place within blocks of the Capitol building itself. During my term in Congress, some of my party introduced a resolution to abolish slavery in the district, which failed, as had all such previous resolutions. It was then that I decided to introduce my own resolution, a compromise measure which I sincerely thought could gain sufficient support to be passed. My proposal was to allow the voters in the district to decide the matters for themselves. It also called for the education and apprenticeship of all children born of slave mothers. Slave owners would be compensated for the value of their slaves, and the current fugitive slave law would be left untouched. Unfortunately, it turned out that I had been rather naive to think that my proposal would be acceptable to a Congress which was becoming ever more divided on any issue related to slavery. In fact, the slavery question would dominate the next session of Congress, but I would only be a citizen bystander at that point. That Congress ended up passing the far-reaching Compromise of 1850, which, although it ended slave auctions in Washington, still allowed for slavery to exist here, a situation which would still be true when I returned a decade later as president-elect. Meanwhile, back in Illinois, I was becoming acquainted with more free blacks in Springfield and other parts. Springfield had a small but growing community of free blacks, among them William Flourville, whom we called Billy the Barber. Within a 3-block radius of our home, there lived perhaps 20 free blacks, including Jamison Jenkins, just a few doors down the street from us. Mr. Jenkins was a drayman, a coach driver. In fact, he was the one who took me to the train station when I left Springfield for Washington to become president. He also once risked his life to help some slaves escaping along the Underground Railroad. We often had hired help at the house. Of the many domestic servants who came and went over the years, at least 4 were free black women. The one I especially remember was Mariah Vance, or Aunt Mariah, as we called her. She worked for us about 2 days a week over a period of about 10 years, right up to the time we left to go to Washington. When we packed up our belongings for the move, we gave her various items as keepsakes. Excuse me just a moment. Now, during the first half of the 1850s, I didn't involve myself much in politics. But then came the year 1854, when the great slavery question rose up again. When Senator Stephen Douglas introduced and Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which changed everything. This new law meant that instead of having slavery contained in just one part of the country, with the hope and expectation that one day we'd be rid of slavery, now slavery be allowed to spread into the West, even into the North. We might never get rid of slavery now. I started giving speeches denouncing this. I also joined a new political party, which had been formed to oppose the further spread of slavery. Well, the state of Michigan had something to do with it. It was in Jackson, Michigan, that the first state convention of the Republican Party was held. We had a first presidential candidate in 1856, John Fremont, but he lost to James Buchanan. Then in 1857, just 2 days after Buchanan took office, the Supreme Court, under Chief Justice Roger Taney, issued its decision in the case of Dred Scott, ruling that no slave nor his descendant, even if a free person, could be a citizen of this country, and therefore had no standing to sue in court. They wrote furthermore that Congress had no authority to exclude slavery from the territories, nor could any territorial government exclude slaves. Roger Taney offered the following historical analysis to support his view that Dred Scott was not a citizen. This is Roger Taney speaking. Black Africans imported as slaves had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. This opinion was at that time fixed and universal in the civilized portion of the white race. It was regarded as an axiom in morals as well as in politics, which no one thought of disputing or supposed to be open to dispute. Roger Taney, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, I knew in my heart that Taney's claims were false, that our founders most certainly did not universally hold this view, and I began to formulate arguments against it. I, along with many other Northerners, were becoming convinced that a slave conspiracy had infiltrated the highest levels of our national government, and that their objective was to make slavery a nationwide institution. And this is why the next year, when Senator Douglas was up for re-election, it was such an important election, not just for Illinois, but for the whole nation. The Republican Party nominated me to face Douglas, and I gave a speech you might still remember. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. It will become all one thing or all the other. Douglas and I subsequently held a famous series of debates during which he went after me repeatedly over my stated belief that the government could not endure permanently half slave and half free. Why can it not exist divided into free and slave states? He asked. The great men of that day made this government divided into free states and slave states, and left each state perfectly free to do as it pleased on the subject of slavery. Why can it not exist on the same principles on which our fathers made it? In response, I argued that our founders had not made our nation that way. They found it that way. Remember that slavery had been introduced into this land over 150 years before the Declaration of Independence. And the only reason that they left it the way they found it was they did not know then how to immediately remove slavery without causing even greater evils. But at the same time, they took meaningful steps so that the people would understand that slavery would be in the course of ultimate extinction, that someday we would eradicate this blot from our great land. Speaking of the Declaration of Independence, I also disagreed with Senator Douglas's view that the authors of that great document did not mean to include Negroes in their claim that all men are created equal. I responded as follows. I think the authors of that notable instrument intended to include all men, but they did not mean to declare all men equal in all respects. They did not mean to say all men were equal in color, size, intellect, moral development, or social capacity. They defined with tolerable distinctness in what they did consider all men created equal, equal in certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They did not mean to assert the obvious untruth that all were then actually enjoying that equality, nor yet that they were about to confer it immediately upon them. They meant simply to declare the right, so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. They meant to set up a standard maxim for free society, which should be familiar to all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. Perhaps you are wondering why I just said that the founders did not mean to say all men were created equal in color, size, intellect, moral development, or social capacity. I may have been thinking not so much of our founders, but of others closer to my time. A new field of study called ethnology had emerged in the 1830s and 40s, a purportedly scientific study of human races, which attempted to account for the differences among them. A friend had a book on the subject, which he lent to me. It was entitled Types of Mankind. I read the book with interest, but was not entirely convinced. The authors presented various evidences to support their theory of polygenism, that each human race had a separate origin, and more specifically, that God had created several distinct races and positioned them in their respective places. As I said, I read the book with interest, but was not entirely convinced, as it did present purportedly scientific evidence that the races were not equal in certain important ways, including intellectual capacity. I did have to acknowledge the possibility of this being true. When it came to how this evidence was applied to social and political issues, however, I most certainly did not agree. Pro-slavery advocates used it to make the case that Negroes, as well as Indians, were inherently inferior to Caucasians, and therefore the enslavement of the former by the latter was just part of the natural order. The autumn of the next year, 1859, brought John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, another substantial increase in the tensions. About 6 weeks later, I made a speaking tour of the territory of Kansas. I was now better prepared to respond to the claims of men such as Douglas and Tawney and many others regarding the history of the slavery question and the views of our founders. I made several speeches, including one at which I said, "The general feeling in regard to slavery had changed entirely since the early days of the Republic. You may examine the debates under the Confederation, in the convention that framed the Constitution, and in the first session of Congress, and you will not find a single man saying that slavery is a good thing. They all believed it was an evil. They made the Northwest Territory forever free. They prohibited the African slave trade. Having thus prevented its extension and cut off the supply, the fathers of the Republic believed slavery must soon disappear. There are only 3 clauses in the Constitution which refer to slavery, and in neither of them is the word slave or slavery mentioned. Now, why was this word kept out of that instrument? The reason is this. The framers believed that the Constitution would outlast slavery, and they did not want a word there to tell future generations that slavery had ever been legalized in America. I was not alone in making such arguments, of course. Frederick Douglass also defended the framers of the Constitution from the charge that they had deceived the black man. "No," Douglass said, "this would be a slander upon their memory, for the Constitution was not pro-slavery. In that instrument," he said, "I hold there is neither warrant, license, nor sanction of the hateful thing. But interpreted as it ought to be interpreted, the Constitution is a glorious liberty document." Like Fred Douglass, I had come to the uncomfortable conclusion that the South had undergone a startling radicalization in its thinking about slavery. We all know that Thomas Jefferson, the man who penned our Declaration of Independence, was a slave owner. Yet he was also very mindful of the moral injustice of slavery, solemnly declaring that he trembled for his country when he reflected that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. George Mason was another prominent Virginia slave owner who fought against the slave trade and even made a speech in the Constitutional Convention arguing for the abolition of slavery. 2 generations later, however, his grandson, Virginia Senator James Murray Mason, would say this: "I'm satisfied that the mind of the South has undergone a great change to this extent, that it is now the almost universal belief in the South, not only that the condition of African slavery is in their midst is the best condition to which the African race has ever been subjected, but that it has the effect of ennobling both races, the white and the black." Likewise, throughout the South, all the more moderate opinions of our founders have been pushed aside and replaced with more strident and radical ones, not only no longer acknowledging the injustice of slavery, but proffering excuses for it, that it was a positive good, that it was the natural condition of an inferior race, even that it was the Almighty's will and plan for humanity. That winter of 1860, I made another speaking tour, my longest and most important one yet, out east to New York and New England. This tour included my famous Cooper Union address, in which I demonstrated that the majority of the signers of the Constitution believed that Congress did have the authority to restrict slavery from the territories. That May, I won the nomination of the Republican Party to be their candidate for president in the election of 1860, facing Senator Douglas and 2 others. The following November, I won that election, thus signaling a change in course for our nation on the subject of slavery. Namely, that while it would still be allowed in the South, it would not be allowed to overrun the rest of the nation. As a result, within 3 months of my election, 7 of the slave states decided to secede from the Union, form what they called a new country, the Confederate States of America. They adopted a constitution which was very similar in many ways to that of the United States, but they didn't try to hide slavery. Instead, they insisted that in their new country, no law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves shall be passed. 4 months later, I took the oath of office in Washington, here, amid great tension. In my inaugural address, I reiterated that my administration would not interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it already existed. We had no authority to do so under the Constitution. If civil war came, Our only objective would be preservation of the Union. And when war did come, and with it the secession of 4 more slave states, neither would emancipation be a wise military strategy. When General Fremont and later General Hunter issued unilateral orders declaring free the slaves of all rebels in their jurisdictions, I overruled them both. If I had not, the remaining 4 slave states, the so-called border states, would very likely have joined the Confederacy, which in turn would have augured an early end to the war, with victory for the Confederate side. And what good would those proclamations of emancipation have done for the slaves in that case? No, in my mind, during the first year of the war, the time was not yet right to address the issue of emancipation. But there were other steps which could and should be taken. I spoke of 2 of these in my first annual message to Congress. You might be surprised to learn that one of these issues was the slave trade, which had been abolished back in 1808. More than 50 years later, this odious practice was still taking place, illegally and clandestinely. We took strong and immediate action against it, having already seized 5 slave ships, condemned to death the captain of one of the ships, and fined and imprisoned 3 other persons involved in the trade. The second issue was the recognition of Haiti and Liberia. Haiti had been an independent nation for over 50 years, and Liberia for nearly 15. Yet the United States did not maintain official relations with either, mostly because Southerners had blocked such measures. I suggested to Congress it was about time that we recognize the independence and sovereignty of Haiti and Liberia. In response, Congress passed a bill authorizing appointment of diplomatic representatives to both nations. As the war approached its 1-year anniversary, I judged that the time was now approaching to finally address the emancipation question. There were actually 2 related issues, each fraught with difficulty: how to bring about emancipation and what to do about the slaves, or for the slaves, once they were emancipated. It was clear to me that emancipation would need to come about in steps, and the first step was obvious: to get Congress to finally eradicate slavery from the nation's capital. Thus, I was very pleased on April 16, 1862, to sign the District of Columbia Emancipation Act, which, just as I had unsuccessfully proposed 14 years earlier when I was in Congress, was based on compensated emancipation. It was admittedly a small step. It only freed about 3,000 slaves, but it was a very important one, for it was the first meaningful action taken toward the eventual abolition of slavery since the Missouri Compromise more than 40 years earlier. Within 3 more months, by July, I determined that the course of the rebellion had reached a point where I did have authority to interfere with the institution of slavery in the South, or more specifically, in those states in rebellion. This is because it had become clear to all that the fact that there were slaves in the South was helping the South in their rebellion. I began working on what would come to be known as the Emancipation Proclamation. In the meantime, I tried to prepare the people for what was to come by responding to a public letter from Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, who questioned why I hadn't yet acted. I responded with an open letter of my own. As to the policy I seem to be pursuing, as you say, I have not meant to leave anyone in doubt. I would save the Union. I would save it the shortest way under the Constitution. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. Now, I'm very sorry to learn that the previous citation is sometimes quoted in your own day out of context in an attempt to show that I didn't care about the slaves. They conveniently forget to quote my concluding statement. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. On the advice of my Secretary of State, William Seward, I opted to wait for a military victory in the Eastern Theater before issuing my proclamation, in order to give it a better chance for a favorable reception. The said victory was slow in coming due to the slowness of General McClellan to engage the enemy. But then General Lee did us a great favor by invading Union territory for the first time. McClellan was forced to respond, and the result was the terribly bloody Battle of Antietam or Sharpsburg in Maryland. Next day, Lee retreated back into Confederate territory. And although McClellan didn't pursue him, to my great disappointment, it was the victory I had been awaiting. 5 days later, on September 22nd, I issued my preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Preliminary because I wanted to give the South one last chance, which would also end the war. If the rebellious states would come back into the Union during the next 100 days before January 1st, things would be just as they were before, with slavery left intact in the South. This is what the Constitution still said, after all. If they didn't return, however, I would declare on that date that their slaves would be free. Note that the Emancipation Proclamation would not apply to the border states, those 4 slave states which are still loyal to the Union: Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri. But we were working at the same time to get those states to voluntarily abolish slavery. The preliminary proclamation was received just as I knew it would be, applauded by some, denounced by others. I likewise was alternately praised or vilified. Overall, there were probably more people against it in the North than for it. In fact, as expected and feared, we lost ground in the midterm elections that fall. By the beginning of December, it was clear that none of the Confederate states was going to take me up on my offer to return to the Union. So I proposed to Congress another plan, which I believed could end the war. I requested the passage of a constitutional amendment, providing for compensated emancipation and voluntary colonization. I appealed to them to look past their differences and to unite around my compromise plan. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. It was a plan which I firmly believed could end the war and save both lives and money, but Congress could not or would not get over their differences and failed to approve it, and the war continued. Meanwhile, January 1st came around, and an anxious nation waited to see whether I would go through with the Emancipation Proclamation. Per tradition, on New Year's Day, a huge public reception took place here at the White House. I was supposed to have signed the proclamation before the reception, but I found one word I wanted changed and sent it back for a revision. Meanwhile, as the 3 or 4 hours of the reception passed and no news going forth about the signing of the proclamation, people around the nation were becoming convinced that I had backed down in the face of the vehement opposition it had generated. But I had not changed my mind, not one bit. After the reception was finally over, I came up here to my office to sign the proclamation. After so much time spent shaking hands during the reception, however, my hands still shook as I picked up the pen. I put the pen down, rubbed my hands together. If my hand shakes when I sign it, I said, they will say he hesitated. I want everyone to know that I had no hesitation whatsoever. I even signed my full name, Abraham Lincoln, rather than my normal signature of A. Lincoln. I said I never in my life felt more certain than I was doing right, than I do in signing this paper. If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it. Given its importance, I suppose I ought to read the proclamation to you. I shall skip the beginning section, which simply refers back to my preliminary proclamation of the previous September, in which I advised the rebelling states of my intention. I then proclaimed, now therefore I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, do, on this first day of January, in the year of our Lord 1863, order and designate as the states and parts of states wherein the people thereof respectively are this day in rebellion. I then listed those states and parts of states which were still in rebellion, and to which the proclamation would apply. And then I continue. And by virtue of the power, and for the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are, and henceforward shall be, free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence, unless in necessary self-defense. And I recommend to them that in all cases when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. And I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution, upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. Now, practically speaking, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free many slaves that first day. Remember, it only applied to areas still in rebellion and not under Union control. But it meant as the Union forces gained territory, the slaves were liberated. And it also meant that this war is no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now also about giving freedom to the slave. I mentioned earlier that in addition to the issue of emancipation itself, there was a second related issue. What to do about the slaves once they were emancipated? What to do about 4 million people, 1/8 of the entire country's population, once they were made free? Nearly all were poorly educated. Most did not even know how to read or write, their owners having prevented their education. Most had never known what it was to be free, to work and provide for oneself. And most white people of the time, even the more enlightened ones, would not welcome them into their own communities to live. How then would they live? Where would they live? Could they even survive? During the previous several decades, the most obvious solution to many white Americans, and also to some Black leaders, was colonization. That is, to provide a means by which freed slaves could be returned to Africa, the place to which they would presumably be best acclimated, or alternatively, transported to some new colony in a place with a similar climate, whether in Central or South America or the Caribbean, where they could likewise govern themselves. The most successful of the various colonization ventures which had been attempted so far was Liberia in Western Africa. I myself, following the lead of Henry Clay and others, long believed that colonization to be the best solution to this difficult problem. Thus, in my first annual message to Congress, I recommended that steps be taken for colonizing liberated slaves at some place or places in a climate congenial to them. Congress responded by passing acts in April and July, which freed the slaves then under the protection of the Army and authorized money to assist in their colonization. Now, since the previous fall, my cabinet had been discussing a project for colonization in Panama. I had appointed a commissioner who did much good work on the subject. He arranged for an interview between me and a committee of free colored men. I informed this committee about the funds appropriated by Congress and then explained why I thought this the best course for both races, noting that there were great differences between the races and how this was a great disadvantage to us both. Their race suffered very greatly by living among us, while ours suffered from their presence, with white men now cutting one another's throats in this terrible war, which never could have come about if it were not for the presence of slavery. Even when they ceased to be slaves, they were still yet far removed from being placed on an equality with the white race. Therefore, I said, it is better for both of us to be separated. I discussed the possibility of going to Liberia or to a new colony in Central America, which would be much closer, easier to get to, and was actually a very excellent country for any people, with great natural resources and advantages, harbors, coal mines, etc. 2 days later, I received a letter from the chairman saying that they had been entirely hostile to the idea until all the advantages were presented. He said they would hold a consultation with other leading colored men in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, and he thought they'd be supportive when hearing all the advantages. In the meantime, Senator Pomeroy of Kansas recruited 500 able-bodied Negroes willing to be the first colony. But then the problem started. The neighboring nations of Honduras, and Nicaragua, and Costa Rica protested the venture, and it looked like the coal mining company didn't have clear title to the lands. Other problems arose with respect to other colonization ventures, such that by December 1862, it appeared that Liberia and Haiti were the only places that Black colonists might go, with certainty of being received, but they did not seem so willing to go to those places. In addition, the Black leaders made it be known that after thinking and talking the matter over further, they were not in favor of it after all. They noted that although their people had not come to our country voluntarily, as the white population generally had, many of them had been here for as many generations as we had been, and felt this was as much their country as it was ours. As Frederick Douglass had famously proclaimed years earlier, "We live here, have lived here, have a right to live here, and mean to live here." In the end, the Panama Project never happened, and another attempted colony on an island off the coast of Haiti ended in disaster when disease took the lives of many of the first colonists. After these failures, I finally gave up on the idea of colonization. This would mean, of course, that the white and Black races would just need to learn to live alongside one another to some degree of harmony. But for that to happen, it would be helpful for there to be a greater measure of equality between the races. Keep in mind that at the time, the rights accorded Blacks, even free Blacks, were in most of the states significantly less than the rights accorded whites. Their rights were often restricted in terms of voting, serving in militias, serving on juries, and many other ways. And this is why the provision in the Emancipation Proclamation allowing the freed slaves to serve in the armed forces was especially important and especially controversial. By late spring 1863, we had established the Bureau for Colored Troops and made the decision to allow Black soldiers not only to garrison forts and perform other support duties, but also to engage in combat. It was another small but important step forward toward equality, something that Black leaders had been advocating. The newly formed United States Colored Troops fought bravely and well, which began to dispel the widespread belief among the white population that Black men would not make good soldiers. This led to the recruitment of more Black troops. By the end of the war, nearly 180,000 would have served in the Union Army and nearly 20,000 in the Navy. Although Black soldiers were now essentially performing the same duties as white soldiers, however, they weren't being paid the same. At the time the law authorizing Black troops had been passed by Congress, it was assumed that they would only be used for support duties and not for combat. For that and other reasons, a Black private in the Union Army was only being paid $10 per month, $3 less than that received by a white private. Note this was only true in the Army. In the Navy, the white and Black sailors received equal pay. This was still the situation in the Army when a special guest came to see me at the White House in August 1863. He had done much to recruit Black soldiers for the Army in the North, but he had recently announced that he would no longer do so because of the unequal pay. He came to Washington hoping to see me, but wasn't even sure that he'd be allowed in the White House, he being a Black man. When I heard, however, that a certain Frederick Douglass wished to see me, I received him almost immediately. We had never met before, but I knew all about him and told him so. He had criticized my Emancipation Proclamation for not going far enough, also other policies such as my support of colonization. So I welcomed this opportunity for us to meet in person and talk over some of these things. I listened to him as he expressed his views, and I in turn explained why I'd done certain things and not done others. I noted to him how I was often constrained, on the one hand by our laws, by the Constitution, and on the other hand by public opinion. I told him there was often a difference between what I should like to do personally and what I was permitted to do in my official capacity as president. On the issue of equal pay for the Black soldiers, I assured Douglass that I was in favor of this, but that we needed help from Congress to resolve the issue. Douglass later was quoted as saying that although he was not entirely satisfied with my views, he was nevertheless so well satisfied with the man that he determined to go on with the recruiting. I in turn spoke highly of Douglass, calling him my friend. I had overcome many obstacles in my own life, but when I considered all that he had overcome, so much more than I had ever faced, I could not but wonder about this remarkable man. He was clearly my equal, or even my superior, in so many ways, in intelligence, courage, moral character, speaking ability, In fact, he appeared to be my equal in every way, except in the color of our skin. As for the equal pay for the black soldiers, Stanton and I urged Congress to correct the situation when they reconvened that December. It took a while, but Congress did eventually legislate equal pay and even made it retroactive. If Frederick Douglass thought I was moving too quickly or too slowly on emancipation, others thought I was moving too quickly. In fact, about the same time that I received Douglass at the White House, I was preparing a letter to be read to a large meeting of Union supporters to be held back in my hometown of Springfield. This is part of what I said. But to be plain, you are dissatisfied with me about the Negro. You dislike the Emancipation Proclamation and perhaps would have it retracted. You say you will not fight to free Negroes. Some of them seem willing to fight for you, but no matter. Fight you then exclusively to save the Union. I issue the proclamation on purpose to aid you in saving the Union. But Negroes, like other people, act upon motives. Why should they do anything for us if we will do nothing for them? If they stake their lives for us, they must be prompted by the strongest motive, even the promise of freedom, and the promise being made must be kept. A few months later, I gave a little address at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on the occasion of the consecration of a cemetery for the Union soldiers who had died in the great battle there the previous summer. I opened my address by looking back to the founding of our nation. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And I concluded my speech by speaking of the task which lay ahead. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Not long after my address at Gettysburg, I submitted my third annual message to Congress, in which I noted my profound joy and satisfaction that some of those states not included in the Emancipation Proclamation were moving closer to emancipating their slaves. Maryland would abolish slavery in November 1864 and Missouri in January 1865. But not all the news was good. By midsummer 1864, with the war dragging on, it was becoming increasingly clear that I would not be reelected that fall. The Democrats had nominated former Union General George McClellan, but on a platform of peace. We're tired of this war. We want peace, peace at any cost. The cost, we all knew, would either be to grant the Confederacy her independence, to divide into two nations, a free North and a slave South, or to remain one nation, but leave slavery intact, forever intact in the South. I was urged to withdraw the Emancipation Proclamation in order to ensure my re-election, something I would never consent to do. As I had written that letter to be read at Springfield, the promise being made must be kept. The situation appeared so dire that I summoned Frederick Douglass back here to the White House. I knew if McClellan were elected that fall, that one of his first actions as president would likely be to rescind the Emancipation Proclamation. I therefore requested Douglass to organize a band of scouts composed of colored men to go into the rebel states beyond the lines of our armies, to encourage the slaves to cross the lines in order to secure their liberty before the opportunity was lost. Yes, the situation was dire, but then fate or providence intervened. Beginning in late August, continuing through the fall, the military situation in the Eastern Theater began to improve. By the election in November, the people of the North were willing to stick it out a while longer, as it appeared that the end of the war might finally be in sight. I was re-elected. Once re-elected, I turned my attention to ensuring emancipation would be permanent. The Emancipation Proclamation was a war measure, an executive order, you might call it, meaning it could be overturned by some future president or by the court. I began working closely with Congress to pass a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery and involuntary servitude from the whole nation. It was a difficult fight, but the historic day finally arrived on January 31st, 1865, when the House of Representatives narrowly passed the amendment. Of course, 3/4 of the states will need to ratify it for it to become law, but I'm hopeful that by the end of the year, we'll reach that goal. The emancipation cause was also helped along by the fortuitous passing of Chief Justice Roger Taney, author of the despised Dred Scott decision. I nominated and the Senate approved my former Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, as the new Chief Justice. Whereas Tawney had declared that black slaves and their descendants could never be citizens of the United States, one of Chase's first actions was to accept the application of John Rock, a black lawyer, to practice before the court. Excuse me there. Don't need him there yet. By the time of my second inaugural address on March 4th, it was clear that the war was almost over. The North will have been victorious. The Union will have been preserved. Slavery will be on the path to final destruction. I suppose the people were expecting a victory speech, but I instead gave them a somber theological reflection on why we had suffered so much as a nation. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that mind by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid with by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. It was not meant to be a popular speech, and it wasn't, but it was a truth which I thought needed to be told. Yes, I firmly believe that our Civil War was nothing less than a punishment by God for our having permitted the odious institution of human slavery within a nation dedicated to liberty and equality. I should mention one last speech. In fact, it was the last speech I would ever make. It was April 11th, 1865, 2 days after General Lee surrendered to General Grant. A large crowd had gathered on the lawn of the White House, right outside here, to celebrate. And I spoke of what we would do when the war was finally over, how we would unite the nation again. I knew an important part of this process would involve the question of the former slaves. As we discussed earlier, colonizing them elsewhere was no longer a viable option. Therefore, it seemed to me that we needed to begin taking steps to make them and their future descendants true fellow citizens. Abhorrent as this idea was to many of the white population, including many listening to me that day. The best way to begin, I figured, was to suggest this for two classes for which there could be less objections raised. Speaking of the negotiations to bring Louisiana back into the Union, I said, it is unsatisfactory to some that the elective franchise is not given to the colored man. I would myself prefer that it were now conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers. I know a lot of people listening that day were not at all happy to hear this suggestion, knowing full well it would just be the first step, would eventually lead to suffrage for all Black men all over the nation, along with other rights of citizenship. In fact, one of the people listening to me that day was a man you may have heard of, a certain John Wilkes Booth. Something tells me that he wasn't very happy to hear my suggestion. I suppose that Frederick Douglass was happy to hear it, however, for it fulfilled his prophecy that once let the black man get upon his person the brass letter U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket. And there is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship. And if we grant black men the right to vote, what next? Some of the ladies have been clamoring for the suffrage. I suppose that'll come about someday too. Well, when one considers all that happened in this country in those 4 short years, from April 1861 to April 1865, in the context of our nation's long and eventful history, it is nothing short of remarkable. The institution of race-based slavery had been introduced to the American continent in 1619 and had continued unabated, in fact, growing ever more widespread and entrenched during 240 years, some 8 to 10 generations. But then suddenly, during 4 short years, slavery suffered its death blow, brought about in large part by a great and terrible civil war, which killed more than 600,000 men. A general emancipation was declared for all slaves living in the rebelling states. Black men, including many former slaves, were given the right and privilege to serve in the United States military and eventually would receive equal pay for their service. The idea of colonizing the slaves elsewhere was largely discredited and discarded, and steps were underway, such as granting the right to vote, which would eventually make Black Americans equal citizens. I do not know what may have happened in our country since my time in regards to these issues, but if history provides any clue, as it often does, I would imagine that additional progress has been made, but by fits and starts. There will likely have been times when great advances were achieved, or at least seemingly achieved, only later to see steps backward. Yet I hope and trust that the overall direction has been forward. As I said earlier about the ideal of equality expressed in our Declaration of Independence, I think the authors of that instrument meant to set up a standard maxim for free society, which should be familiar to all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors, everywhere. Well, thank you for your attention. I trust you've gained a better understanding of this important issue in this hour we've spent together. And at this point, I'm going to stop speaking. I'm going to give you the opportunity to ask me some questions. Of course, I can only answer questions from my own time period up to April 14th, 1865, about 10:15 p.m. No questions after that. No questions about your current politics. Not able to answer those. You have a couple options here. One is you may use the chat feature, I believe it's called. Yeah, you've made great improvements to the telegraph, I must say. You can send your question over chat. You don't even have to use the dots and dashes. Just type in the letters straight there. Or if you wish, I believe you may be able to unmute yourself and you can ask the question out loud. Either one is a possibility here. And I don't know if Emily or Evan have anything else to say about all that.
Thank you so much. That was really, I learned so much. Thank you again for coming. I don't know if anyone has any questions. You may have already mentioned this. I might have missed it, so I apologize. But did you ever get a chance to visit the colonies that I know they failed eventually, but were you ever able to go there? Did you travel?
Are you referring to Africa?
Yeah, to Africa, to Liberia or Haiti. Did you ever make a trip there?
No, I never was outside the boundaries of the United States of America. Unless I may have gone over to, I went to Niagara Falls once, and I don't remember if I went to the Canadian side or not, but that's, if I ever left the US, that was it, and it was only for one day.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, but we had plans. Mary and I were just talking. In fact, the last day I remember being alive, we were talking about our plans for the future. How when the war's over, when I'm done being president, we're going to travel. We're going to California. We're going to Europe. We're going to the Holy Land. So looking forward to that. All right. Questions? There must be a question out there somewhere.
There's got to be other questions.
Oh, Doug C.
How do you reconcile your admiration for Andrew Jackson and the fact that you were anti-slavery and he aggressively purchased slaves?
Or now you're referring because of the fact that I got his picture up here?
Well, I had that question anyways, but yeah, that picture kind of prompted me.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if I really call it an admiration of Andrew Jackson. I mean, I thought he did some fine things in his lifetime, but I didn't agree with all he did. Remember, as I grew up, my family was a Jacksonian Democrat, and I rejected that. And I aligned myself with the opposition party, the Whig Party. Everything the Democrats were for, the Whigs were against. Everything the Democrats were against, the Whigs were for. That's how it worked. So I wouldn't say that I admired Andrew Jackson necessarily. I will say this, he did appoint me postmaster in New Salem. You might wonder, why did a Democrat appoint a Whig as postmaster? Well, that's because there weren't too many people living in New Salem, and you need a man who's honest and who knows how to read and write, and I fit the bill. So maybe that's why I left his portrait up here when I moved into the White House. It was up here before I got here, you see. Good question, though. Thank you. I think I saw a question in the chat. Doug, Mr. Lincoln, can you please describe your speech writing process? Well, it takes me quite a while to write a good speech. Let me say that. It's not like I could just sit down the day before a speech and write it all out in a sudden burst of inspiration, using the back of an envelope or something. I should flatter myself to think I were that clever. No, it takes me a while to write a good speech. And I often use ideas I've used before, you see. I'll just give you an example. July 7th, 1863, we got word from the Battle of Gettysburg and the fall of Vicksburg. And I gave an impromptu speech right outside the White House here, and the lawn. I said, what's it been? Some 80 odd years since the founders of our nation declared that all men are created equal. Oh, anyway, and then later on I said, this has the makings for a great speech, but I'm not ready for it yet. 4 months later, I was ready. And that some 80 odd years turned into 77 years ago. So it takes me a while. I need to kind of work through things and try different things out and move things around until I get it just right. In case you're curious, I do write my own speeches. I've had some people ask me if I had speech writers. See, your politicians today can't write their own speeches? Anyway, good question. By the way, I should mention, I got 14 programs in all. And one of my other programs I call Lincoln on the Gettysburg Address. I tell exactly how that speech came to be as I recall it, you see. All right, another question.
Hey, Mr. Lincoln, this is Chris Zurich from this past weekend. Just wanted to say I really appreciate
yes,
the
sir.
presentation.
All righty. Any other question? Maybe I'll go ahead and let you know some of my other programs. You might be curious. I got a program that's all my stories and jokes. That's a lot of fun. The program you had tonight was probably my most serious program. I got another one that's a whole hour of stories and jokes. I got one on Thanksgiving. Tells how Thanksgiving came to be a national holiday when I was president. Some people forget that was me. I got one on leadership. Talk about my leadership qualities. Things like acknowledge your mistakes and learn from them. Be honest, be empathetic. Things I'm sure all your politicians still do today. I got one on immigration. Do you know, after slavery, immigration was the most important social and political issue of my time. I got one on my law career, got one on my political career. I got one on religion and the Bible. Talk about the religious atmosphere of the country when I was growing up and how I use the scriptures so often in my writings, far more often than you might think. I got one on literature and the theater. Anyway, 14 programs in all. And if you're interested in learning more, well, there's a place you can visit. And I'll just give you a little clue here. If you don't know how to get there, just ask a youngster. They'll help you out. And Tad's a whiz with this sort of thing, the telegraph and all. It's a www.mrlincoln.com. And if you go there, you can read all about my programs, you see. Of course, I also do programs in schools and senior homes and that sort of thing. And I should mention, if you go to this place, you can also visit other places. And you can go to the Book of Faces, or Facebook, I think it's called. Facebook, yeah. And the other place, Twitter. I've been told all presidents need to tweet, so I've been doing that now. I only send about one a week. That's all I can do. Can't keep up with that other fellow we had before. And the other place you can go is called YouTube. If you'd like to hear the Gettysburg Address in English, Spanish, French, or German, you just go to YouTube. You can hear it there. Or just ask me right now. All right, another question.
Mr. Lincoln, I was just wondering, what was your vice president's? Did he have the same view as you did on slavery?
Oh, well, I had two different vice presidents.
The second one.
First term was Hannibal Hamlin. I'd say we were pretty much in agreement on things. In 64, we made an important change. And you need to understand the reason for the change. 1864, we're looking toward the end of the war. We got to bring the country back together. We need to unite the country again. And so we changed our name. We were not the Republican Party in 1864. We called ourselves the National Union Party. We wanted those Democrats who favored finishing off the war to join us, you see. And what better way than to name a Democrat my vice president? How about a Southern Democrat at that? How about Andy Johnson, only senator from the only senator of the 11 Confederate states who had remained loyal to the Union? Kind of his reward, you might say. And now, Andy Johnson, well, I'm not so sure what he believes on some things. I do know he's got a couple of issues he needs to work on. When we had the inauguration, the vice president's inaugurated first. I don't know if you know that. They do it inside the Capitol building. And Johnson got up to speak, and he spoke and spoke. He went on for an hour. He was drunk. I told my men, don't let Johnson speak outside. And then, well, the other thing about Johnson is, Yeah, I don't like having enemies. I once said, the best way to destroy my enemy is to make him my friend. Andy Johnson doesn't mind having enemies like a lot of politicians. And well, he needs to learn something that, well, if you make too many enemies in Congress, Congress can do something to you. It's never been done that I know of, but I think it's called impeachment. He just might want to be aware of that. All right, another question. Any other questions out there?
Really quickly, I just want, did Hamlin want to step down, or was it a mutual thing that you had Hamlin? Like, I was kind of confused. Is it a mutual thing that you wanted Hamlin to the first one to step down,
Yeah,
or?
I think the decision was made apart from me, I think, because I was satisfied with Hamlin. It was more of a decision at the party level of, those sorts of things are negotiations, aren't they? Even we always wanted to have people from different parts of the country. When a president makes his cabinet, it's very important to have representation from different parts of the country. And so, that certainly went into it. But I don't think I was necessarily, it wasn't my decision per se. It was more of a joint decision among the leaders of the party about which direction to go in that. And as far as Mr. Hamlin himself, I think he was just very willing to serve again if he were asked to. But he also recognized that it really wasn't his decision either. By the way, I mean, vice president really doesn't do much, right? He's just kind of there. I mean, he doesn't even come to cabinet meetings. He's just there just in case. And we're really not expecting anything to happen, right? I mean, I made it through the first term all right. And the second term, the war's about over now. I don't think there's much reason to be worried, do you? And by the way, we got tickets. Oh, never mind. Another question. Any other questions? In case you're all curious, I currently live in a place called Adrian, Michigan, down in Lenawee County. So from Northville on a regular day with nice roads, it's a little over an hour or so. By horse, it's maybe 4 or 5 hours, but not too far away.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Lincoln. We really appreciate everything. And we hope to have you back to the Northville Library in person very soon.
Oh, I'd love to come in person. And I suppose I should show you outside here. Still light here in Washington. I don't know how that happened.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. All right. All right. No, I don't think we have any other questions. So thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a good night. Stay safe if you still have to travel. All right.
All righty. Bye, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Bye. Thank you.